So we'll get started here. But first, what I'd like to do is introduce our esteemed guest and my co-host of the Jesuit Book Club. So first, Brother Guy Consolmagno, welcome. The Brother Guy is a Jesuit brother and the director of the Vatican Observatory and the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. He obtained his Bachelor of Science in 1974 and his Master of Science in 75 in Earth and Planetary Sciences from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and his PhD in Planetary Science from University of Arizona in 1978. He took vows as a Jesuit brother in 1991 and then had to do more studying. He studied philosophy and theology at Loyola University Chicago, physics at the University of Chicago before his assignment to the Vatican Observatory in 1993. He has co-authored 2 astronomy books, Turn Left at Orion and Worlds Apart, and is the co-author of 4 books exploring faith and science issues, including The Way to the Dwelling of Light, Brother Astronomer, God's Mechanics, and Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? Brother Guy, you're very welcome.
Okay, I even have a new book out, which is much slimmer on in the series called My Theology, and it's God in the Universe. So
very good. We'll have to update the Vatican Observatory website to include that.
Right. That's true. There's always something to do.
I know, right? The work never stops. Nick Ripatrazone is my co-host of the Jesuit Book Club and has been with us since the beginning, a couple of years now. This is probably our, Nick, 8th or 9th gathering in different forms.
We're almost at 10, yeah.
Yeah, Nick is a writer, editor, and a teacher, and he has a lot of books as well. And his newest one is I think it's the newest one, Digital Communion, Marshall McLuhan's Spiritual Vision for a Virtual Age, which is from Fortress Press. His other books include Longing for an Absent God, Faith and Doubt in Great American Fiction, and Wild Belief, Poets and Prophets in the Wilderness. He is the culture editor for the Image Journal, which is a quarterly magazine that seeks to publish the best writing and artwork informed by or grappling with religious faith. He's also a contributing editor for the Catholic Herald out of the UK, where he covers American Catholic culture and artists. And just as of, I think, this week, maybe today, he has a new column for the website Lit Hub, where he's writing about literary journals, literary magazines. And he's also written for Rolling Stone, GQ, The Atlantic, Paris Review, Esquire, Outside, The Sewanee Review, America, Commonweal, and elsewhere. So, Nick, thanks so much. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Let's get going. You take it away.
All right. Brother Guy, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in. First question I have for you is, the book is arranged as a dialogue between you and Father Paul Muller, your colleague at the Vatican Observatory since 2010. The concept of dialogue seems essential to the Jesuit sensibilities of inquiry and examination. And your conversations in the book are really by turns introspective, they're funny, and sometimes they get a little contentious. So what is patently Jesuit about argument as a mode of intellectual inquiry?
Well, I have to first confess that it was a literary trick. Both of us wanted to tell personal stories. And we realized this was the easiest way of seeing whose story was whose, so we could both speak in the first person. And as a result, we realized the richness of having this dialogue, because the real message, the subtitle of the book is Other Questions from the Astronomer's Inbox. The unspoken subtitle is All the Stupid Things People Keep Asking Us. And, the publisher wouldn't go along with that. But they're not stupid. But they're questions without fixed answers. And that's what we wanted to get across. The fact that we can argue about these things, we can argue in a friendly way, we can disagree, we can call each other short. Every time one of us comes up with a glib answer, usually me, I'll be called out by him, and he was very good at that. I think that sense of dialogue, that sense of having more than one point of view and having friends with more than one point of view is very much what you get in a religious order like the Jesuits, the wide range of people. There was a real lesson to me as a novice. I was a novice in the 1980, 89, 90, where my novice master was your classic 70s liberal, sensitive New Age kind of guy. Wonderful guy. And he brought in to teach us history a fellow who, had a portrait of Maggie Thatcher on his wall, because he was a Tory. That's the only way to describe him. and they were best of friends. And that taught me more than any series of lectures, that this is what it means to be a Jesuit, to be a member of a community, to have dialogue. I think C.S. Lewis described one of his friends as somebody who's interested in all the same things and has completely different opinions about all of them. And that's really what we tried to get across in the book, that these are questions that are pondered. Paul came up with this marvelous image. The first scientist is Mary. You remember when she's coming home from collecting the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple, trying to figure out what the heck was that all about. And what does Luke tell us that she does? She doesn't go home and write a 3-volume treatise on Christology. She ponders these things in her heart. And the questions we address are questions ultimately without answers, questions to be pondered in your heart.
I like that sense when you describe mystery. I think it's in that section where the idea of mystery, that word used in a scientific context, could mean a puzzle, something you could figure out. Whereas in a religious context, theological context means it's something that you could always go deeper into, but you're never going to exhaust the answer. And that's really, is, as you're saying, animates a lot of the questions in the book and your reflections on them. And early in the book, so you say you just mentioned the dumb questions people keep asking glibly, but not really dumb, important big questions, and that you have a file of more than 700 emails from the past 5 years, and that you say that a lot of these messages, quote, tend to presuppose a conflict of some sort between science and religion, end quote. So why do you think it is especially important for Catholics to, as you say, kind of hold those two concepts together with integrity and consistency?
Well, for one, to quote John Paul II, who was quoting St. Thomas Aquinas, truth doesn't contradict truth. And that means that ultimately, whatever turns out to be true in science and whatever turns out to be true in theology will make sense. But we're not there yet. And we shouldn't expect to be there yet. What's more, in my life as a scientist, I've never actually come across a place where my religion said one thing and my science said another, because they're not really talking about the same things. But what I do find all the time is this little bit of science contradicts that little bit of science. And that's when you get excited, because you go, oh, I'm about to get a paper out of this. I'm about to discover something new, because something that I thought I understood, it turns out I understood incompletely. And now I see a way in which I understand it incompletely. The big problem is the way we teach religion and the way we teach science. We teach science as you pass the course by getting the answers in the back of the book. And that's not science. That's what you have to do to get up to speed to do science. But that's not science any more than playing scales on a piano is playing music. It's a finger exercise. And likewise, we teach kids the catechism. Now, I grew up, you can tell from the gray hair, I grew up with the Baltimore Catechism, where you memorized these questions and these answers. And late in life, I appreciate what that was about, because eventually you go, oh, that's what they were talking about. Then you've got these words that you can suddenly apply once you know what they mean. But certainly when you're rattling them off as a kid, they're going to sound meaningless and rather shallow until you've actually lived what they're talking about. I can see why that's maybe not a good way of teaching kids, but it's, the best way that we have. And yet that's not religion. Getting the answers in the catechism isn't the religion. Getting the answers in the back of the book isn't the science. The real thing is both of them are activities of love. And you never run out of discovering new things about the person or the thing that you're in love with.
That's a great way to say it. Activities of love for both of those pursuits in life. And I like how you said we want to distinguish between sort of getting people up to speed with science, but the practice of it. And that really, I think, helps me imagine this. As I was reading this, I was feeling equally informed and entertained. It feels like a decidedly pastoral book. As an example, your points about the book of Genesis, I thought were really illuminating. I want to quote a few lines that you wrote. What was new in Genesis was the idea that the universe was created deliberately, in an orderly fashion, by a God who existed distinct from that universe, already there even before its beginning. That's the theme that's common to all the different creation stories you can find in the Bible, from the two different stories in the first two chapters of Genesis to the creation without cause described in the second book of Maccabees. And that is what is markedly different from the Babylonian creation myths, which taught that the world was a mistake, an accidental offshoot of other things the gods were doing, end quote. How would you describe the pastoral elements of your role as a director of the Vatican Observatory?
We really want to show the world that the church supports science. And I can write these books, but the simple fact that I'm standing here with this collar and this MIT ring is really the only thing I have to do. And that's, there are plenty of Catholics who are scientists. I was a Catholic who was a scientist before I was a Jesuit. And, they don't know any less than I do of theology or science, but you need the symbolism of the guy with the collar and the ring. And then you have to listen to where people are. That passage came because I was actually challenged by a friend of mine who was, a good scientist, knew I was a Jesuit, and said, hey, I just found out that the Babylonians had a Babylonian creation story that's just like Genesis. Didn't they just swipe it from the Babylonians? And it made me realize it was a great question, because it made you realize it's not the creation that the story is about, it's the creator. And that's what's new. And that's what's constant in all the stories over the, 500 years that the scripture was written.
I want to keep talking a little bit about Genesis. I imagine a lot of the questions you get and questions you look at in the book connect to Genesis and those questions about what is going on in Genesis. What type of a text is Genesis? How do we square that with the Big Bang? To me, that's like sometimes an easy question, but like also one like, well, yeah, what does someone like that who wears that collar and has that ring that you showed, like, what do you say about that? And so you, in the book, use a section of Augustine's commentary on the book of Genesis that I'll read. Usually, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth, the heavens, and the other elements of this world, about the motion and the orbit of the stars, and even their size and relative positions, about the predictable eclipses of the sun and moon, the cycles of the years and the seasons, about the kinds of animals, shrubs, stones, and so forth. And this knowledge he holds to as being certain from reason and experience. Now, it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an infidel to hear a Christian, presumably giving the meaning of Holy Scripture, talking nonsense on these topics. And we should take all means to prevent such an embarrassing situation in which people show up vast ignorance in the Christian and laugh it to scorn. So as a Catholic and a scientist, how do you think we should envision the Bible as a text? And then also, in what ways is science present in its narratives?
Well, Genesis is marvelous because it's a great example of a lot of the things you find in Scripture, and fairly easy to pull apart and analyze. The first thing is to remember that we are not Muslims. It is not the Quran. We're not claiming that God dictated it word for word in some language that we don't dare translate out of. It's written by human beings. It's written with the inspiration of God, but not a dictating of God. And it's obviously gone through a series of edits. Here is a simple thing that anybody can do. You don't have to be a scripture scholar. Take the story of Noah's Ark and just read the odd numbered verses. And you've got the entire story there. And then read the even numbered verses. And you've got the entire story repeated. And it's obvious that somebody had the two stories and melded them together in a relatively crude way. That demonstrates not that, the story of Noah was false, or the story of Noah was completely, only. It just says human beings wrote this, and human beings are going to write it in a form of poetry. The other thing, when I did my high school, I did classics. I didn't do the sciences. I learned a lot of poetry. I learned how to analyze data by analyzing poems. And the one thing you learn is that the ancient people mostly wrote poetry for a lot of practical reasons. It's a lot easier to remember. than long passages of prose. We can remember songs that way, and I'm sure they sang the Iliad and the Odyssey as a way of remembering it. But somebody once asked me, God's trying to tell us about the origin of the universe. Why didn't he tell us about the Big Bang? And the answer is wonderful. It's because if God had told us about the Big Bang using everything we know in 2022, it would have been incomprehensible in the year 1900. And it probably would be laughable by the year 2100 if we're doing our job right. Science has a sell-by date. Science books go out of date really, really quickly. You don't use your grandfather's copy of the biology text you used when he was in high school. You can use your grandfather's copy of Plato. There are certain kinds of knowledge that are timeless, and science isn't one of them. So if you're trying to turn Genesis into a science book, you're not doing it any favors, because you're condemning it to become obsolete. And if you're trying to turn Genesis into the owner's manual for your Volkswagen, you're doing a terrible disservice to what the poet is trying to say. Because we use poetry to express the things that words can't contain. And if there is ever anything that words can't contain, it's the nature of God.
It's curious too, to maybe unpack a little more about when we hold those things together, poetry and scripture, and then what we learn from science, and that we can learn all of these things about the universe, that universe started this way, and also the universe, the world started this other way, that seem very different. Is it just different questions that science and religion are asking? Or are they after different things? I think in the book you do a good job of kind of making sure we don't mix up kind of what the ends of these pursuits are.
I mean, it's such a common mistake. It's got a name. It's called concordism, where you try to draw, the Big Bang started with a burst of energy. Genesis says, let there be light. Obviously, the writer of Genesis knew. No. And the important thing is to recognize not only does it not work, and maybe, in 100 years or 1,000 years, we'll realize the Big Bang was a complete misunderstanding of the data. Who knows? But the creation ex nihilo, which is in Scripture, God creating out of nothing, means that time and space itself is a creation of God. And that means that creation in this sense didn't happen just 13.8 billion years ago at the Big Bang. It happens in all places at all times. Stephen Hawking claimed that he could explain the Big Bang by a fluctuation in the space-time continuum, which leads to one of my favorite puns in the book that I'll spare the rest of your audience. But he's still thinking of God as inside the universe, setting things off with, setting the spark that sets things going, as if God was one more force alongside physics, or, alongside gravity, or alongside electricity. And that's not the God of Scripture. That's the God of the pagans. That's Zeus throwing lightning bolts inside the universe, rather than God who is transcendent as well as being immanent.
Yeah, as I love what you just said, and it makes me think of Marshall McLuhan's his lament of the concept of the Newtonian God versus, as you say, this more incarnational, transcendent, ever-present, and that just, it's quite a great way to say it. Yeah.
And that Newtonian God is the first step to atheism.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Buckley wrote this wonderful book on the origin of modern atheism. And if you think I'm going to believe in God because he explains this gap in my knowledge, as soon as you close the gap, then you have no more reason to believe in God. If that's what you're basing your faith on, you're believing in a God that doesn't exist. And if that's your God, you're better off not believing in him. Because that's not the God of Scripture. That's not the God of love.
I'm learning so much even just talking to you now. And I think one of the things that really informed me in terms of sections of the book was the Galileo affair. I've heard so much about it in my life, but the way that you articulated, the way you unpacked it in your conversation really helped me. And you know that the events that are so often cited by people thinking the church is anti-science, that they look to that affair, that moment. And as you say, it's because they don't have much else to cite. It's one of the few examples they can come up with where the Catholic Church made that particular mistake. So why do you think certain elements of the secular world continue to have such an incorrect view of the Church's vision of science?
It comes from the 19th century. It certainly was, few people put it that way. I think maybe Descartes, but few other people saw it that way. Most of the scientists in the 17th and 18th century were clergymen, because, who else had the free time and the education to do science? But at the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of political movements in Europe and America that were anti-clerical and anti-Catholic. In the Americas in particular, there was the idea that people from Catholic countries, Southern Europe, my ancestors, Eastern Europe, they were somehow inferior and we had to keep them out. What I think was really going on was eugenics. Eugenics was seen by the science popularizers of the day, the H.G. Wellses, and the people who wanted to feel like they were on the cutting edge of knowledge, like, Oliver Wendell Holmes or Alexander Graham Bell. These were the people who saw Newton's description of evolution, which is perfectly reasonable, and extrapolated it to say, here's how we can purify not only how we can purify the human race, but it explains why people who look like me are obviously superior to people who look like you. And the church was one of the few places that this was opposed. You read the Scopes trial. Everybody knows Inherit the Wind. Few people have actually read the textbook that Scopes was using, which is a horrible textbook. It explains why the white race is superior to all the other races using science. It explains why eugenics was the way that we're going to purify. It's a textbook leading up to the death camps of Nazi Germany. Nobody remembers that. There was a reason why good people were opposed to this. And sadly, why a good science like evolution got such a terrible press. But it was popular for political reasons to then use this as a stick to beat the church. And in the process, you create all of these wonderful myths that aren't true. Galileo was a brilliant scientist, but not for the reasons that people think. All the things that we claim he was the first to do, actually, he wasn't the first to do. The proofs that he had for the heliocentric system weren't valid proofs. He didn't have the goods. But his ability to look at the world and envision it in a bigger way, the fact that he could look at the mountains on the moon from above and knew they were mountains. Who else had seen a mountain from above before? He had the artistic vision to be able to do that. And he was a good Catholic. People forget that he went along with the church, even when they were treating him unfairly, because he valued that. He was a great Italian, a great Catholic. And frankly, in those days, if you hadn't been brought before the Inquisition, then there was something wrong with you, It's a wildly different story than what we're taught. At the end of the day, the church was wrong. And they were wrong not because they were anti-science, but because they were using their religious powers for other reasons. We don't know quite what the reasons were. Maybe it was, a personal affront of the Pope. Maybe it was tied up in the politics of the 30 Years' War. Maybe it was any of a number of other things that it could have been. People are very quiet about their motivations, which makes you suspect that they knew themselves the motivations weren't as good as they should have been.
You talk about in the book how many hundreds of books about Galileo have been written and how it continues to fascinate people and can now and again in these times see to be like a stand-in for that battle. But I think you do a great job in the book, and Paul, and kind of poking some holes at that kind of the way that people just use that as a stand-in for these conflicts between science and religion. So I want to stay in Italy, and you in the book describe being at the Vatican Observatory and maybe looking out near Christmas time and seeing a comet decoration, a lit up thing that you can find all over Italy, kind of representing the Star of Bethlehem as a popular Christmas time decoration. And you write about this in the Star of Bethlehem and generally in the book, that no one knows enough to argue convincingly which of these theories would provide the best scientific explanation for the Star of Bethlehem if there was a star. Astronomy, which we had looked to as a source of objective truth, turns out to fail us, not for having no answer, but for having too many possible answers. wondering if you could talk a little bit about the dangers of what you call, and others have called, scientific fundamentalism, the problem of looking to science for the so-called final word.
Well, it's again the fallacy of thinking that science is the book of facts and that science is truth. Science isn't truth. Science is the history of human opinions about the truth. One of my fellow classmates in the novitiate used to complain that newspapers only had statistics and opinions. You know, the statistics would be the stock market and who won the game last night, and everything else was opinions. But that's not a bad thing, because when I study astronomy, I'm part of this community of people who are having a conversation. And the fact that we're having a conversation means we don't know the answer. Otherwise, it would be the world's most boring conversation. It's fun precisely because we don't know. And when you try to turn science into, or scientists into a priesthood of truth, I belong to an order of priests, trust me, real priests have a bad reputation. When you try to make science that, we've seen that in the COVID crisis. Those who are science fans, the science fan club, do science a great harm. When you say, follow the science, don't follow what you find on the internet. Well, of course, they're right. And yet they're making it sound like follow science instead of following Jesus. The very people they're trying to convince, they're using arguments that are going to be offensive to those people. Because as I've seen too often, you're more interested in looking good in front of your friends than in actually reaching out to the people who might disagree with you. We are all guilty of this. We all live in echo chambers. It's just a little bit easier now to do that. The other real question to me about the Star of Bethlehem is not what was this star, but why does anybody care? And I don't mean that in a snide way. I mean that in a profound way. The fact that people do care is telling us something. I was talking to a fellow who teaches in business school. He's, 20, 30 years younger than me. He's teaching to kids who are 20, 30 years younger than him. And he says the disturbing question he's getting from students now is, what's the rubric? What do I have to do to get a good grade? Because they're looking for certainty. They're looking for follow these rules and things will be taken care of. They're looking for the cookbook. And you can cook an adequate meal with a cookbook, but you're not going to be a genius chef. You're not going to create things that are going to make your mouth water, because real cooking is more than following a cookbook. Real science is more than getting the answers in the back of the book. Have I said that a few times already? And so the question of what are people looking for when they're looking, if we could prove that science had this answer for the Star of Bethlehem, it still wouldn't convince anybody, because half the people would say, you see, there was nothing miraculous about it. It was just the star. And the other half would say, you see, the Bible was telling the truth after all, which you just recover the assumptions you made when you went into the argument. That doesn't get you any further.
There are these signs in our neighborhood, and I've seen them in a lot of places, like in this house, we believe. And one of the ones that pops up on those signs is that science is real, or science is true. And it's like, that always strikes me as strange. To me, again, it's a process, as you're saying, this process that then goes out of date quickly and is this conversation and is about discovery. It's like, yes, it's real, and that it's a process that people are using, but as if it means like this is the monopoly.
Among scientists, science is a verb.
I think of faith as a verb too.
Yeah.
I had a bishop who would say that anyway. So we are word nerds here, Nick and I, English majors. And I know Nick wants to ask you about our Jesuit poet friend, Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Yeah.
Gerard Manley Hopkins, please.
Well, it was interesting to hear that conversation you just had, because he said Easter is a verb in one of his, I think it was his notebook or one of his poems.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of like the patron saint of our Jesuit book club, and you include his powerful poem Spring and Fall in the book in its entirety, which was great to see. You spoke about this a little bit before, but how did you come to read and memorize this poem as a graduate student? In what ways do you see that poetry and science overlap and inform each other?
Well, There was a Jesuit high school. It was University of Detroit High School, and Father Polakowski was this phenomenal English teacher. Not the only good one I had, but certainly one of them. And he introduced us to the Jesuit poet. One of the great things about Hopkins, of course, is that he was completely unknown in his time. Very few people knew of his work. And it was decades after his death that it was published. And they inserted the word Manly in his name, which he never used, because the editor of the Oxford Press was a nephew with the same name. And they were afraid, oh, this obscure poet might be confused with a very famous editor of the Oxford Press. Yeah, right. But it is beautiful in so many ways. First of all, it works. It evokes a picture. You can smell the leaves. You can hear them crumbling under your feet. And it also evokes in you the weepingness, the melancholy, the really sweet melancholy of autumn, especially autumn in Michigan or the Northeast, where you've got the leaves turning colors. So it works. And then the question is, okay, as a scientist, how does it work? What's he doing? Why does he use these words? Why does he have this rhythm section? It's not a sonnet. It's got one extra line that stops it from being a sonnet. Why is he doing that? Because he's no fool. He's doing it for a reason. He's doing things to pull you out of your expectations, to make you stop and look in a different direction. And so it thrilled me, both as a person of the arts who loves poetry and as a nerd who loves to see, as you say, a word nerd who loves to see the gears and levers. Another poem like that I fell in love with in high school was the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which, when you read it and you understand it, is not only glorious, but it's a satire of itself. He is being deliberately outrageous because he's evoking the college sophomore who's feeling sorry for himself. That's really what the poem is all about. And he does it so brilliantly in not just the words, but in the form. And that makes you realize that God is a poet when he created the universe, because the rainbow is beautiful, and the Maxwell's equations that explain why the rainbow works the way it does are also beautiful. It's beautiful to look at, and it's beautiful to pull apart.
So in addition to poetry, a source of beauty, I know you're a big science fiction fan, and that science fiction played a pretty big role for you, even in your professional path. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about why that genre interests you, and then maybe if we've been recommending some books and poems, if there are anything you've read recently or ones that you come back to, any science fiction texts you might recommend to us.
Well, I came from a family of book nerds. Everybody read. My brother, who was always in trouble and got flunked out of the Jesuit high school, was a tremendous reader and wound up getting a master's degree in creative writing. And I was the youngest, so I would, the books would be passed down to me. And so books were sacred in the household. And that's the first thing. But beyond that, just to tell you a story of how books were sacred. Story goes in my family that my father discovered after my brother graduated high school that he had a high school library book that he had swiped from the high school library. It had not been signed out. How could you do this? He called him in, how dare you? And my brother says, look at the book. It's Jack Kerouac, On the Road. Okay. Look inside. It's a first edition. Who would leave a first edition of this book in a high school library? My dad goes, you're right, of course. So as a book nerd, we were always going to the library. That was the big treat. And you'd go to the kids section, but I'd read every book in the kids section by the time I was 9 or 10 or 11. The science fiction section was just inside the grown-up section. And in those days, science fiction stories were pretty much PG rated. So our parents didn't mind us stepping inside and finding a science fiction story. My dad had loved science fiction in his day. So simply as a way of, the first grown-up literature, but it was also literature that pulled you out of your world and showed you adventures that actually, as a grown-up, you realize science fiction stories are not about a distant galaxy far, far away in time and space. They're about the here and now. Star Wars was about the American political scene of 1977, and George Lucas will tell you that. And you can find other stories. Cordwainer Smith's fabulous stories are really about the 1950s and the civil rights movement. But when you write them in terms of a fantasy, in terms of a story far away, you lose your prejudices. You don't come in with your defenses already built. Well, I already know what these people are like. I know how he's trying to manipulate me there. So the guy's got, green tentacles and 12 arms. You don't know immediately if he's supposed to be a good guy or a bad guy. And you have to spend the time to figure it out. There's also the fun of the puzzle that a really good written science fiction story will not tell you what's going on that's different from your universe. It drops hints that makes you try to figure it out. But darn it, isn't that what we do in the real world? Isn't that what every kid does, trying to figure out what the grown-ups are talking about? I have a friend who's a science fiction writer, Joe Walton, who calls this in-cluing. And as an example, say you've got a machine that you want, everybody in the world knows how this machine works, but you, the reader, doesn't. How do you express this to the reader? Well, you can say, well, Bob, as you know, this machine works in this way. And of course, that's terrible writing. Or you can say, the machine's broken. It doesn't do the such and such anymore. That's part of the story. That's completely believable. But then the reader can follow along and say, oh, that's what that machine is supposed to do. And it's not just the machinery, because eventually it's also the effects of the machinery. Lois McMaster Bujold has written these space operas, and they've got these horribly garish covers, and they're ridiculous. And her plot device is always take her hero and make everything that is horrible possibly happen to him, and then see how he can get out of it. And he always does at the end of the book. So it's popcorn. But in the process, in some of the things that she produces, she starts asking questions that are worthy of contemplating in your heart, because she doesn't give you the easy answer. Her first books were, frankly, thinly disguised Star Trek fan fiction. And yet she writes them in such a way that you realize that the people you thought of as the bad guys aren't all bad. And the people you thought of as the good guys, well, they suffer from original sin too. The technologically advanced, liberal, everybody is happy civilization makes its money selling arms to everybody else. Oh, where have I seen that? California? And, she'll have a device, simple device that works as a plot device, where when a woman's pregnant, they immediately pull the fetus out and put it in this artificial external fetus. She goes on and has her life. And 6 months or 9 months later, comes out, pops the cork, and there's your baby. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What would this do to society? How would this affect the way that we treat sexual relationships, parent-children relationships? These are great questions. And you can explore the questions in stories, because if the writer gets it wrong, you can feel immediately, nah, that's not right. That's not the way it's going to happen. That's not the way real people work. I mentioned my friend Joe Walton, who's written some marvelous fantasies. One about Cerignola called Lent, which anybody who's got a love of history of medieval Italy would enjoy. Her great book is called Among Others. And I know enough about her to know that there are some things that you just sort of say, no, I'm sorry, that's too much of a coincidence. Those are actually things taken from her real life. In the process, she describes dealing with elves in a real world, that the belief has to be believed, because there's always plausible deniability. If you want to say that those are just figments of her imagination and everything they do is just a coincidence, if you want to believe that, you can. But if you want to say, no, these are what really is happening, Well, it's a beautiful description of prayer, where you can talk yourself into everything that happened to me was because I prayed for it, or nothing has to do with prayer. It's all just, some coincidence that just happened to occur at the right place at the right time. She has a way of bringing these things to life in people that you like enough to want to follow what they're doing. You cringe at the decisions they make because you like them. And that's what good science fiction does. It allows you to play thought experiments with the universe. What would the world look like if? And what does it mean that the world isn't like that?
It's fascinating because the way you've just talked about science fiction, and it's, I guess, the philosophical elements being endemic to the genre makes sense to me also why you like poetry, because poetry, the mode of language as inquiry, the seeking ambiguity, seeking things that are ineffable, it kind of makes sense that those interests both appeal to you.
Because it's ambiguity, but it's directed ambiguity.
Yeah.
Though I'm not sure if he means this or that, I do know that the poet doesn't mean all of these other things.
Yeah, that's great. You ask some profound rhetorical questions near the end of the book. I'll read a few of them. You wrote, "Are we willing to accept the presence of another self-aware entity in our universe? And even if we are aware of the presence of God, are we willing to accept that there are other self-aware entities besides me and God who are also aware of that same God?" Now, we probably wouldn't live up to our title as the Jesuit book club if we didn't put you on the spot with paradoxical questions. So how would you answer those questions yourself?
Let's find out. You can't go in ahead of time with an answer. You ponder them. You realize that the glib answer, "Oh, of course I'd be happy." Well, no, it's kind of scary. It's scary the first time a baby encounters another baby and knows that there's two of them and, oh, we're going to fight over the same toy. It's frightening to have to deal, especially, an introvert nerd like me, to deal with other people. There's a reason I'm a brother. And yet nothing is more worth doing than that. At the end of the day, to have a friend who's interested in all the same things you are, but has different opinions about them. Only that can challenge you. That's why I love writing books with co-authors. Paul and I could come to blows, and of course, his style of writing was completely different from mine, and we infuriated each other. But I think because of it, the book is a whole lot better than a book that either one of us might have written alone.
I'm going to take a moment here to allow folks, if they have specific questions for Brother Guy, you can put them either in the chat or in the Q&A function. And as they do that, I know earlier on you had talked about this sense, I think, would you call it the concordance problem?
Right, yes.
With that, again, concordism, right, where you try to,
you try to stuff today's science into what's in scripture.
Right. Or to see that if God could then fill in gaps in our knowledge, and then that those gaps disappear, then we have no place for God. So my question for you, and you don't have to answer this, I guess, but I'm curious, why do you believe in God?
Because I've experienced God. That's part of it. I go into it a whole lot more in a different book called God's Mechanics, which, alas, is out of print. But the God hypothesis, shall I say, allows me to understand the world in so much more rich a way than being an atheist would. It answers questions that atheism doesn't, such as, you've heard of the problem of evil. What about the problem of good? If there is no God, why is there good in the world? It gives me a sense of how I can orient myself. And when I experience God this way, including a personal God, including a God who I experience in prayer, who sets up these divine coincidences for me, it not only has this ring of truth, which is coherent with the way I've experienced the universe and the creator, that every scientific question and problem ultimately does have an answer, which is going to be infuriating because it's going to lead to new questions. but also that it's a universe that in the answering, the most elegant theory will be the correct one. The most beautiful equation will be the one that carries the truth. And I can understand a universe that was rational and would not work otherwise, but there's no reason why the rational universe has to be beautiful. And there are any number of machines out there that are examples of that. But the best machines are the ones that are beautiful. Why is that? What is that telling me about the universe? And then at the end of the day, I go back to the experience of prayer, where I know God is there. And I know all the more because there are times when God isn't there. And I recognize God from the absence.
Well, thank you for sharing those reflections. That wasn't on the pre-list of questions. We do have some questions coming. We'll have time for a few. We have one about the ideas in the book about the origins of the universe. And could you say more about how that that idea relates to the work being done at the Vatican Observatory?
Right. There are two things that people ask about in cosmology: the beginning of the universe, the end of the universe. The end of the universe is great fun, but we have no data from the future. We've got a lot of data from the past. So you can put some limits on how the universe evolved and what it was like at the beginning. And there's a small group of, between Gabriele Giunti, who works specifically in the question of quantum gravity, what's going on in the Planck time in the first 10 to the minus 43 second of the universe. We've had other people doing the mathematics of cosmology, and we've got a number of people who work in this field as adjuncts. They're members of the observatory, but are employed elsewhere. Maria Elena Manzoni at Stanford, who's looking for dark matter, and Adam Hinks up in Toronto, who's, again, doing observational cosmology. It's a great question because it's a lot of fun physics. Even my meteorite work, we've got rocks that are 4.5 billion years old. I know because I can measure their ages using isotopes. And they are therefore keys of the past that tell me, just as much as a pyramid tells me that there were people in Egypt a while ago. There were things going on in the solar system at that time. And this gives you a sense of all the ways that it could have happened. This is the way it did happen. What is that telling us?
So an interesting question just came in. I know William Shatner has been talking a lot recently about his trip to space and what that did to him. And so Judy asked, she said she heard William Shatner say that we humans are so small in relation to the vastness of the universe. We are obviously insignificant. And she says that when her unbelieving friends say the same thing, she says, well, how big would we have to be significant? So curious for you, Brother Guy, what would you say to William Shatner and Judy's friends about the relationship between our size in relation to the universe and our significance within it?
Well, it's
scale blue dot, right?
Nothing new there. It's in Soulmate. It's right at the beginning of Soulmate. So we've known this for a long time. And there are two big fallacies that you can make. One is that size matters. And the other is that your life only matters, but your life is a mystery novel and the only page that counts is the last page. Both of those are crazy ways of looking at life and looking at the universe. The central truth of our universe is the existence of love. And wherever love exists in whatever creatures who are in some kind of relationship with God, that is the center of the universe, around which everything else, all of the stars and the planets are there to make love possible. That's my belief. And love is God's expression within the universe. But frankly, her answer is a classic one. It's a perfect one. All right, how big would you have to be? How small a universe are you looking for where you're the most important? I got to meet William Shatner once, and he was a fun guy, but he was utterly befuddled by the fact that I could be a Jesuit and a scientist. And this freaked him out so much, he just go, wait a minute, I don't get it. And I don't think he ever will.
Is it ever tiring to be perceived as a walking contradiction?
It's fun. I love confounding people's expectations, because if they're sharp enough, then they will realize, okay, the world that I was in was too small. The thing I find frustrating is that most of the clever things I want to say, C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton or somebody else has said them, a century before me. But still, it is fun to shake up people's worldview.
We have a question about the Webb Space Telescope and what it might be discovering around the origins of the universe. I am curious more generally about what have you thought in reaction to these images, the Webb Space Telescope images as you've seen them?
Well, it's much like my reaction of just looking at the sky. I have the same reaction as anyone does. Oh, they're beautiful. I have the same reaction looking at the stars. Oh, they're beautiful. But in addition, I know what they're looking at. And so there is this extra depth to what I'm looking at. Oh, not only is that beautiful, but that's the Eta Carina complex. I remember looking at that at my little telescope. I remember, that's the ring around Neptune. And I can explain some of the physics, and I'm excited about some of the physics that goes behind it. And there's another level of depth beyond that. I know the people involved. The people who made the cameras are, the Ricci's, George and Marcia Ricci. I've known them since the 1970s. The image of the ring of Neptune was sort of a birthday present to Heidi Hammel, who's in charge of planetary observations with the Webb. I've known her since she was an undergraduate at MIT. And so I see in these pictures the stories of the people I know, the stories of the science I've learned, and the raw beauty of the pictures all together. It's like a three-dimensional cube.
I don't see, we have a couple more minutes. I'll ask one question and let's see if we can get any more last ones that come in. But I know when we had talked before for a podcast, Brother Guy, I had asked you about, some criticism of space exploration or astronomy. Can't we focus on the problems we have here on Earth? We have all kinds of issues we need to solve. Like, why bother? Are we spending too much money on trying to go to the moon or to go to Mars or any of these projects? We should be focusing on other things. And you told some really, I thought, really interesting stories about your work in Peace Corps in Africa and bringing your telescope with you there. And maybe you could share some of those. One of those.
The short answer was I had those same questions when I was an astronomer. Why am I doing this when people are starving in the world? Besides, I couldn't get a job at the time, so I was feeling pretty cynical about the whole thing. And I was 30 years old. I quit my postdoctoral position at MIT. I joined the Peace Corps. And what they had me do was to teach astronomy to graduate students. But at the same time, I brought my little telescope and I carried it up country where my other real Peace Corps people were. And everybody in the village wanted to look through the telescope. Have you ever seen the moons of Saturn through a telescope? Have you ever seen the rings of Saturn and not gone, wow? Because that's what human beings do. And it eventually hit me. This feeds our soul. We don't live by bread alone. And I saw in practice what happens to people who had been told, I'm sorry, you're not good enough. You can't do this. You can't do that. Then without that sense of feeding your soul, it's very easy to despair and never being able to solve the real problems of hunger. But when you have the chance to realize I can ask these questions, I'm as good as the people in the West. I'm as bright and as curious, and I have something to say to this world. Then you see the world as a place that you can participate in and improve locally, even as you dream globally. You can only see the problems on Earth by getting off the Earth and looking down at them.
Oh, thank you.
Metaphorically, if not literally.
Sure. I'm going to give you one more. I know we have a couple more that did come in, and I appreciate those. We won't have time for all, but I did say, I think one of the people in their check-in was saying they were watching with a 9-year-old future astronaut. And then Kathleen asked about recommendations for young people exploring faith in the context of a college campus, which to me can sometimes mean people exploring maybe faith in science for the first time or a young astronaut. So any words of encouragement or things to suggest for some of our students who might be joining us?
Anybody. And 9 years old is the perfect age, but 9 to 90. There's a book I would highly recommend called The Stars, A New Way to See Them. It teaches you the constellations, but it teaches you the sky. Rather than a book of facts about the universe, it's a book of pictures about what you see overhead. And the guy who wrote it was H.A. Rey, was the guy who wrote Curious George. So you know he was a great writer and a great cartoonist. I got this book when I was 9. I still have a copy of it over in my shelf. I can show it to you. I use it as a textbook when I teach. And that connection to all the knowledge you find on the internet and the web pictures, those are things you can actually see up in the sky. At least you can see where they are. It's the real universe that you can go up and touch. And sometimes we forget that, just like theologians forget that the God that they're theorizing about in Scripture is also the God they encounter in Mass. Same God, trying to tell you something. Beyond that, I would say, so the book for the 9-year-old, the author is H.A. Rey, R-E-Y, and it's just called The Stars. It's been out since 1950. It's still in print. And in college, if you're the parent of a college student, don't be worried if they're questioning. They're supposed to be questioning. The faith of a 10-year-old is great when you're 10, but it better not be the only faith you have when you're 20 or 25. You better have realized that the God you thought you believed in was so much richer and so much scarier and so much less certain than the God you encountered in the catechism.
Well, it is 5:30 now, and that's, I think, a great note to end on. And I thank you very much, Brother Guy, for taking the time in your travels from Rome to Tucson and all over the world. And this was a really wonderful conversation. I'm so glad people here could be with us live, and then those who will be able to watch it later. This will be a great resource for us.
And if I can end with a plug, our website is www.VaticanObservatory, all spelled out, .org. And you can find all sorts of stuff like this and more.
Yeah, I was going to say, great blog posts. There's good swag, so you can get yourself a ball cap or a shirt and learn a lot there. The site's a really great place. And also on social media. And you can, And again, thank you so much. And we'll hopefully everyone can get out and look up sometime tonight or tomorrow and think about all the blessings we have received, the beauty that we've encountered. All righty, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. This is fantastic.
Thank you.